Hey friends, Seeking Our Spirit is back with another episode for you all. Had a great conversation with a friend of mine and parishioner, Andy Hicks. So I hope you enjoy that. As always, if you want to be on the show or if you're curious about spiritual direction, contact me at seekingourspirit@gmail.com. Send me names of folks that you think would be great on the show, or you come forward yourself. That helps us keep things going. And as always, like the episodes, share them around with folks, and hit that support button if you can. Thanks to everybody for all your help, encouragement, and support. It's a great time and enjoying doing this. I hope you do too. Thanks. Take care. So we're rolling. Mr. Andy Hicks, good to have you here with me, and I appreciate you being willing to come on and speak and journey. As always, start off with just a little bit about yourself. Why don't you tell listeners who you are, what you do, where you're from, all that good stuff.
General demographic information.
Yeah.
40 years old, white Protestant male, physicist, chemist by training. I've done a lot of teaching at the community college level. Now I'm doing more industrial consulting. Cradle Episcopalian, but visited many other denominations along the way.
Husband, father.
Yeah, husband, father. Yeah, my wife Blake, who has already been on this podcast, and then we have 3 kids: Vivi, Anna, and Cyrus, ages 10, 7, and 5, respectively.
Yeah.
So
Cool. And a buddy and parishioner of mine for many years now, off and on, depending on where you lived. So.
Yeah, going all the way back to Ascension and the Genesis days.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, good. Awesome, man. Good to have you. I'm excited to, I'm probably repetitive in these often, but it's a joy for me always to get to see a different angle and glimpse into someone's life. Someone who I see regularly and know on a certain level, but don't know certain aspects of their life, so I appreciate it. So, as is the question for everybody starting out, when you, Andy Hicks, think of spirituality, your spiritual life, however you might see that or define that, where does that begin in your life? When do you recollect having what you would have called a spiritual life? Maybe an awareness of that.
Yeah, I guess there was an awareness. I grew up cradle Episcopalian. There's a lot of it when I was a kid was sort of going through the motions. I guess that's what we did on Sundays, and even honestly, the confirmation that I did in 6th grade, is just is what we did instead of Sunday school for that semester. And I mean, it's not that I didn't think about those kinds of things. I did, and I'm sure I sort of gleaned a lot from osmosis or what have you, even if I wasn't really paying attention at it at the time. But.
So it was more of a organized religion, family expectation, just cultural. There wasn't much of I don't know if internal is the right word. Like, when did you first sort of feel like you developed a relationship with God or awareness with God?
I remember having there's not like a clear moment that sticks out in my mind. Well, there is one, but I'm sure it happened long before that, right? Like I attended a friend's, non-denominational church, completely different feel with all the altar calls and, the on-the-spot salvations and did that. And it was it was definitely more spiritually intense. I don't want to say it was more spiritually real, but
sure. Just so outside of your norm.
Yeah, it sort of opened my eyes to like this whole other, that there were more ways to worship than just what I had grown up with.
Yeah, there's another way. Yeah, it's interesting. I can't recall if, I guess I've had a couple other folks who are cradle Episcopalians on, but you and I probably have similarities in that I was a cradle Episcopalian, and there's almost like an experience for me of realizing now later in my age and in ministry that there was a bunch of stuff about my upbringing that I just took for granted, because you just always knew it, because that's all you were exposed to, right? And so that's been powerful for me. I don't know if you identify with that, but your story just sort of reminds me of that. Like, that's just what you knew, so it's normal. And so when
Right.
you see something different, it's like, oh, you know. But anyway, I now find like there are things that I took for granted and didn't value as much about my tradition that I now really deeply value. So anyway.
Okay.
But you said, do you have any memories before that experience of just like what was a spiritual life or a relationship with God for you? And it could you could say no.
I mean,
could just
it
be
was
like through church.
I was a jaded teenager, right?
Okay.
I did do like some of the lecture readings when I was a teenager, so I cared enough to do that. But and I still believed in God. I don't know. I remember when I was like 5 or 6, way too young to be asking these questions, asking my mom, what she would think if I were an atheist, and of course, if it freaked her out, she didn't show it at the time. She said, "Well, you still have to keep coming to church." And
You're under my roof.
Right.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But I really appreciated the way that she answered it, and that, I don't know, I guess I worked things out after that, between then and my more formative years. But yeah.
Okay. So if not in so where would you name sort of a spiritual life becoming?
I guess like when I started prioritizing it was when our oldest daughter was born.
Okay.
Right. And sort of this feeling that it's not just about me anymore, I have a responsibility to raise this baby, the way God wants, or I don't know, that's probably not how I thought of it at the time, but I guess that deeper responsibility.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I will say that my daughter's baptism, I think, was a more spiritually deep experience for me than anything else I had experienced in the Episcopal Church up to that point.
Oh, that's interesting. You want to say more about that?
I can. I don't know how helpful it'll be. Just more like just a palpable feeling of importance, and not to say that everything up to that point was unimportant. I'm sure a lot of it had to do with my own mental priorities at the time too. So, yeah.
Okay. So just to be anything as you think. I just don't want to skip over anything. So anything when you think about your childhood, when you think about your adolescence, teenage years, because that's a big swath of time. So like anything that stands out at all or that you remember as being significant or important to you in terms of relationship with God. Like, did you have prayer practices? Were you exposed to daily prayer life, or was it purely just through church,
it was
Sundays, education?
Yep.
Okay.
Pretty much. And it wasn't like a pillar of my life, my day-to-day life, right?
Okay.
It was, that didn't really come until later that, I started like missing church if I didn't go for, a couple of weeks.
That's interesting. So then nothing outside of church, even just, any way that you would have felt like you had an experience of a higher power or God or spiritual.
I'm sure there
Could be
was.
Completely unrelated to church.
During my childhood,
or adolescence, or high school, whatever, college.
Yeah, honestly, I'm telling you, I really felt like I was just going through the motions when I look back on it in hindsight.
All right.
Mean, it was, we're talking about 20 or 30 years ago, but it's not something I think about a whole lot these days. But it wasn't sort of a key focus in my life. I devoted some brain cells to it, but it wasn't.
Okay. So then sort of naming parenthood as being your entrance into a spiritual life.
Maybe not entrance, but that's when I stopped sort of dipping my toes in the water and dove in head first.
Okay. Interesting. So where does it go from there?
Let's see. Well, we had Vivi.
And when you said missing, like you felt like missing corporate religious life, right? Like church life. When did that happen? Where you felt like you missed it? That was just all throughout. Like if you
Yeah,
went
it was
away?
once we got so I like a lot of college students. I didn't really attend much. My late teens, early 20s, or even mid 20s when I was in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't until Vivi was born at the very end of grad school and shortly after graduating that we started attending church
Mm-hmm.
again regularly. And I mean, it was different because now I was there because I wanted to be there, not because that's what
Mm-hmm.
I grew up doing. And I started noticing that, I guess, I started noticing just how peaceful my life felt, when we attended church, compared
Mm-hmm.
to stretches where maybe we went 2 or 3 weeks without attending.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, a couple of things occur to me. And I may be stretching here, so don't let me, say things for you. But like, I don't know. There's something beautiful about that of the coming to take a relationship with God seriously because of parenthood, right? Or in other words, because you now have this being, this thing that you love so more than you ever knew you could love something, and then that bringing you, I don't know. I'm not putting good words around that, but there's some sort of Christology there. I think a little bit, giving yourself over, right, for this thing,
Right.
loving this thing so much that you shift and change your life. That seems very obvious in saying it, but
Yeah, and I mean it wasn't as dramatic as maybe some people's experiences. It wasn't like I'd hit rock bottom or anything like that,
sure,
but it was still a very profound difference
yeah,
for me.
yeah.
And as far as the motivation and yeah,
I mean, the other thing that's interesting to me is, well, so even when you went back to church, then, and that was like sort of the core of spiritual life for you, motivated out of love for your daughter, right?
hmm
Um, so far, it seems like then what you missed though. So what did you miss? Like I guess I'll ask you instead
miss
of. So you said you missed that, or you felt more at peace, you know.
yeah.
But what about it made that? Like for you, what what made that peace happen? Why peaceful? Or what did you miss when you didn't go? Like, is it the people? Like, what about
Yeah,
church?
the
Is it the people in
people.
the community, or is it the ceremony, or is it the
It
like? What
was
is
less
it?
the ceremony and more the people and the conversations and like the I guess learning more about Jesus and all of that.
Yeah.
The
So kind of intellectual
yeah,
end of things, and then relationship.
right. It
Okay.
for me. I mean the ritual and the liturgies. I mean it's nice and sort of comforting to have something familiar, but I've visited other denominations too, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in how they do things as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't think there's necessarily one right way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They all have their place, I guess.
Yeah. But so back then, at that time, when you either missed it or started to go with Vivi, Blake, and start to feel a level of peace, it was more so the community relationships and sort of
Yeah,
intellectual learning
yeah,
over against the ceremony.
yeah. And
Okay.
honestly, I mean, our Genesis groups, I think, were as important, if not more important, than the Sunday
Yeah.
church services.
Yeah. For folks listening that don't know, that's basically a version of like a theology on tap group. But
Yep.
yeah, and I hear that there is something beautiful about those groups. Um, as funny as that might sound, a bunch of dudes getting together and having beer and talking, supposedly talking about a topic, right? My,
Yep.
my my joking rule is that we have to stay on topic for half a pint,
Yep.
and then we can go wherever. But there's something I think actually deeply powerful, and I would say spiritual, about what happens over time in those relationships. How
Yep.
and I don't mean to be hyperbolic here, but like in some ways what happens there, and actually I know for some of the guys that go to that group or those groups, it's more it was more a real version of church for them than anything they'd ever experienced.
Yeah.
Because it was vulnerable and open and true and committed kind of relationship.
Right.
Yeah. And there's just such an eclectic gathering of folks that are all sides on the spectrum, politically and otherwise, politically, spiritually, theologically, whatever. And yet they come together and they like actually sort of deeply know each other. So that's, I hear that. Huh. Okay. So community and relationships seem to be a huge part of, perhaps how God works in your life, speaks to you. Would you say that
I agree with that.
Through other people for you?
Not exclusively, but it absolutely does. Yeah, it's absolutely one of the ways.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so you start going back to church. Vivi's baptism.
We moved.
What else would you point to?
Let's see. That phase didn't last long because I got a job up near Pittsburgh, I think less than a year after we started going to Ascension. And so we moved up there. And it took us a few months to find a church. And actually, we ended up finding two churches. I mean, the Episcopal church that we liked was like 45 minutes to an hour away. So it wasn't... it was one thing to go there once a week, but it wasn't...
Yeah. How are you going to be part of that community that you're talking about,
right? Right. So we found a non-denominational church that was about 10 to 15 minutes away that we started going to. Reminded me more of the church that I mentioned, that I had the more charismatic experience when I was 18. It was interesting to get two perspectives, on the same Christ, I guess, for that long of a time. I really enjoyed that.
Two perspectives on the same Christ. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, what else would you say about that?
In what way? I don't know. I mean, the different styles were very striking. The more care. I guess the thing that stuck out to me was, in the Episcopal Church, I wasn't used to seeing people getting excited about Jesus.
Ouch, Andy.
I mean, that's... I'm not saying that to... I say that in the lovingest way that I can, but...
Well, there's the emotive, right? The old joke of like the frozen chosen is there for a reason, right?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one.
Oh, people say that about various traditional, like mainline denominations, but it is said about the Episcopal Church, the frozen chosen, right? Just sort of naming, it's most Episcopal churches, folks, when they come in and if they don't know the Episcopal Church and whatever, they don't get the warm and fuzzies, right? It's kind of private and people do their own thing and leave you alone and you go in the pew and you pray and you're part of the worship and, but not all places, obviously I'm generalizing, but that is the old joke. So yeah, our worship is not emotive, right? So versus the place you're talking about, it's expressive, right? You're praising Jesus, right? And you could go down all sorts of trails to talk about those things, but it's interesting though. So it sounds to me like you mainly in your spiritual life have been fed through or have had a relationship with God through your kind of learning about God, learning about Jesus, as well as through community and relationships. In experiencing those different contexts, the Episcopal Church and this non-denominational church, was that the same thread? Or because you're sort of naming... maybe you're not. Maybe you're just naming that the people were excited about Jesus. Yeah. It wasn't just how they worshipped.
It was both, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
They didn't stop being excited about Jesus once the service stopped.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think that theme continued though? Mainly what fed you or the way that God spoke to you in that non-denominational church, was that still through the intellectual, the learning of God, and also through the relationships, or was there another?
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of that. So at this time when we were going to two different churches, like all of our friends went to the non-denominational church because those were the people who lived near us, right? Like the Episcopal church was 45 minutes away. So
right. So that became community.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else from that time period or about that experience? How God's working in your life? How you're experiencing God? Or spirituality in general?
Nothing that comes to mind. It's a pretty, I don't know, I could go off on a million different tangents, but we might never get through the whole interview.
Maybe we'll go back and pick some of those up.
Yeah, maybe. Yep.
Okay. So is that all you'd name about that time period?
For now.
Okay.
For now.
And then what happens? You come back?
Then we come back. We tried Ascension at first. Mm-hmm. It didn't have the same feel as we remembered. So our favorite clergyman wasn't there anymore, and so we moved back to Knoxville. Yeah, I skipped that part. Yeah, you're right. We moved back to Knoxville. We started going to Ascension, and did that for a few months, and then I was back home in Kingsport where I grew up, and the rector there, James Mills, told us, "Oh yeah, you should check out St. Elizabeth's," which we didn't even know that St. Elizabeth's existed at the time, even though it was like 5 minutes away, and you were the rector here. So
Yeah, Jay. Yeah, the Episcopal Church is such a small world. That's hilarious. And so then you guys come to St. Elizabeth's, and connect with community again.
Briefly. Mm-hmm. And for a few months, and then everything shut down. And
right.
Our situation at the time, having small kids, like Zoom services just weren't working. So there were a lot of churches in the area that were, of other denominations, but that we would try. There was a Free Will Baptist one for a while that we went to because it was literally the only church that we could find that had in-person services. And then for a while we went to, I can't remember if it's Farragut Church of Christ or Farragut Christian Church. Enjoyed our time there, but we're definitely happy to get back here and at St. Elizabeth's.
Yeah. So that really does sort of stress, though, that for you, I know I'm being repetitive here, but that community, being in the body of Christ, being in the community is a major part of how you experience God.
Yeah, absolutely.
The COVID part highlights that.
Yeah.
Right? It's like if the church isn't open and I can't be part of the community, the worshiping community, the walking in faith life together community, then I got to go have that somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, that's probably the most important part of the church experience. More so than the liturgy. It's the people that you meet along the way and that you form a community with.
Yeah. See, that's the part I'm saying that's so interesting. I guess in the beginning I was wondering if we lined up on some of those things because of being cradle Episcopalians, but actually as we're talking, it's quite the opposite. That's the part that you have gravitated towards, and the part that has been important to you in your spiritual life, being the relationships in the community, was not the part that I even recognized as valuable.
Yeah, growing up, I didn't really have that church-based community. Right? We didn't really do.
It was just worship.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay. I don't remember being that great of friends with anybody in our church. You say hi and all of that, but all of our best, both my personal friends and our family friends, I guess there were one set of family friends that went to our church, but it was more dispersed, right?
Yeah.
It was, I don't know. I didn't get that same community feel when I was a kid as I do now.
Yeah. And it is something, though, that I see now and I see later in life, of just how valuable those relationships are, how much I both witness witness the whatever word we want to use, witness the presence of God, witness the Holy Spirit, witness the Christ within, right? I witness these things in people's lives in a worshiping community. But I did not recognize that or know that before. And so when I was growing up, I mean, what's weird about this to me is I don't think until a good number of years into my priesthood, into the ministry, did I start to see what you're talking about. So for me, my spiritual life, my relationship with God was very, very much internal, personal.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, it's not that I didn't think about God when I was growing up. I certainly did. And, I took philosophy classes and, read plenty.
And I don't even mean thinking. I just mean delving into contemplative practices, meditations, prayer practices, spending time with God.
Yeah. That never was a thing that I thought to do. Mm-hmm. Honestly, the non-denominational church up in Pittsburgh drove that into me more than anywhere else. Yeah. I mean, they were very adamant that, that it will behoove you if you make it a point to every morning. I mean, they had this thing with their men's group, every morning at 6:30 is a 15-minute devotional. And I mean, it was impressive the amount of guys that they had showing up for this online devotional at 6:30 in the morning. It would be 40 or 50 guys.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we'd have a tough time finding 40 or 50 people that would commit to doing that on a daily basis. But I noticed, I guess, that things just seemed to work easier when I did that first in the morning.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. I mean, it's sort of, no knock on the church that you grew up in, but it's concerning that there's not that consistency in the way people, even within the same denomination, are brought up, because those things were taught to me through my church relationships, right? I was exposed to meditation and personal prayer practices, like a plethora of them, as a part of my confirmation and things like that. Which shaped my life, certainly. So it's interesting that the consistency isn't there.
I mean, I guess the Episcopal Church is probably more decentralized than most denominations, if I had to guess.
But decentralized?
At least to the mainline denominations. I mean, once you get to non-denominational, then it starts to splinter out. But I don't know. I may just be talking out of my rear there.
Yeah. So that's sort of, I mean, in terms of your spiritual timeline, right? Based on what you've said today, all the way, basically the big entrance into that, your awareness of that relationship with God starts at the birth of your first child.
That's where the consistency came in. I would maybe go through a season or here and there, but that's where it really stuck.
Mm-hmm. So tell me this: throughout your life, and I don't mean literally, obviously. Some people hear audibly a higher power speaking to them, so it could be that. But when God has spoken to you, led you, guided you, when you have felt God's presence, whatever, in your life, what did that look like?
Different ways. A lot of times, sensory, changes in the way that I perceive the world. Here sometimes we talk about hearing the voice, right? And there's something about the tone or timbre. I don't know. You're more of a music and sound guy than I am, but I would hear somebody say something and it would just resonate completely different than what other people were saying, or if I were reading something, it would almost be I don't know, on the History Channel or whatever, where they're sometimes they'll show the shot where they're looking at some document, and they'll have like a passage that's sort of spotlighted. I mean, I would get that kind of sensation when I was reading. It was like God was
or hearing
pulling those particular, of all the words on the page, it's as if God were pulling this line up off the page to show to me.
Yeah. And reading anything? Or reading, like, do you have any recollection of moments like that?
Let's see. I mean, it happened enough that it wasn't like it wasn't like Moses in the burning bush that one time that it happened or anything like that.
Yeah. So like little, sort of like what we call like nods from the universe.
Yeah, like cosmic winks, I guess.
Sort of like,
and
hey, you're going the right way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Things like thinking about someone, and then moments later they call. Cosmic coincidences that and reading too, like even on my phone doing devotions, like this weird tingling sensation that I would get as I'd like scroll through scripture on my phone. It would like make my fingertips tingle as I did it, and I'd get this same tingling sensation in my temples as well. So that's
interesting.
Some of the examples.
Yeah. Now I'm curious to know with like so take that example of reading scripture. So a lot of what I talk about with people, and I could be totally wrong, but my sense is that intention has a lot to do with things in our spiritual lives. So when you give me an example about like reading scripture, are you marking that and setting that aside as like, hey God, this is my time with you, speak to me?
Yes.
Like, is it prayerful, or are you just picking it up and reading it? Like, is there a marked intent?
Yes. So nowadays what I do on my phone, the Bible app, they have like a daily, it's like a 15, 20-minute devotional, verse of the day, and they'll oftentimes have somebody talk about it for 2 or 3 minutes and give some other commentary. But so that's usually where I start.
Yeah.
And,
but so is there a prayer, like a specific intent to say, like, is there a prayer before you start? Like, does that make sense? Are you just doing the devotion?
Yeah, there's prayers built into the devotion. Like,
okay, so they're giving that to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And along with like open-ended prompts, I guess, for you to sort of create your own prayer, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But I guess I assume you're entering into it already with an intention of like, this is my time with God.
Yes.
You expect to be or hope to be spoken to.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Optimally, yeah. I mean, some mornings, maybe I start out with it just going through the motions, but then, so even those days, by the end of it, it's gotten me back on track.
Mm-hmm. And those sort of experiences for you, like you're saying, the seeing scripture and knowing something is sort of a message for you, or the hearing someone say something and it's sort of something that you take on a spiritual level. Has that happened your whole life, or is that it's sort of just later in life as you delved into the church?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Interesting.
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say that it never happened when I was younger, but I'm at this point in my life, it's not as it certainly wasn't something that I looked for the way I do now.
Good. I mean, that's for me as a priest. It's like, man, that's sort of the goal, is realizing like it's not just in this worship service every Sunday, but it's looking for that all the time.
Right.
Being attuned to the presence of this thing we call God all the time, so that we can be spoken.
I mean,
right?
Yep. I mean, we talked about this in Sunday school about how Paul tells us to pray continually, but I don't think that means that he intends for us to verbalize,
recite prayers,
every waking moment, right? There are, but it's more about the mindfulness and the intention of being intent on what you're doing, I guess.
Yeah, I know it's hard to put words around in it, but it is. It's like holding a mindset, holding an openness, intention. You mentioned burning bush. I mean, so have you had any moments? I mean, burning bush is a little extreme, but like talking about these things, right? Being spoken to, feeling like you're having a message. Do you recall any particular instance of that was
divine intervention?
Well, I mean, divine intervention is probably a little extreme, but like, yeah, just that anything like that where you have felt spoken to, guided, led, felt the touch of God, whatever you want to say, that was significant for you, like a turning point, or maybe it was a wilderness time, or
So I remember wilderness time, like probably my freshman, sophomore year of college. Had fallen into the routine of partying multiple nights a week, like many people do, and really started to take it too far. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, my phone would start acting up, and like it would be like, I'd try to call someone that I knew that I shouldn't like try to get in touch with, because I knew we'd go get into trouble.
Right.
But the phone just wouldn't work, and I'd try calling it would go straight to beeping, or to that number is no longer in service.
Yeah.
And then I went into my contacts and saw that the digit had been their number in my contacts had been changed by one digit, and I guess another.
And you immediately corrected it and then called them, right?
No. I think I got the point.
Yeah.
I think I had one of those times when the numbers leapt off the phone. It got through to me.
You were not supposed to call this.
Yeah.
Like a spiritual roadblock.
There.
That's interesting.
Yep. Okay. I guess a more recent one. I had talked, we've talked about how much trouble I had figuring out my Enneagram number, right? Uh-huh. And on a business trip, I forget which one it was. It was within the past 6 months or so. I was thinking about it and walking back to my hotel, and at that same moment, like I got a notification from my phone about like some food I'd just bought for dinner, and like, so your purchase of 888888 has been approved. And like the meal I cost didn't even cost, $8.88, but that's what it came up. It's like and
were you thinking that you were thinking about it?
Yeah. When that notification came up.
Was the conference talking about it, or you
No. This was like nerdy science conference, but this was like later in the evening, right?
You just
walking back I'd stopped to pick up some takeout to take back to my room, and wondering about it, the Enneagram message on my phone to remind me that I just bought food, and the price was all wrong. It said it was 88888. Right. Well, okay.
And you tied that together and took that as And now when you look at Enneagram stuff and look at it, you're like
it makes more sense.
That's interesting.
I don't know. For a while there were like 4 different numbers when I read the description of them. Maybe like 40 to 60% of it sounded on point, and like 20 to 30%, well, maybe, and then there'd be another 10 to 20% that said, no, not.
That's
it doesn't seem to fit at all.
That's almost like a intuition kind of thing, I don't know. As you said, wink from universe, nod universe. That's interesting. Cool. I hope people who listen know what the Enneagram is. If you don't, you should check it out.
Yeah.
It's good for you. It's certainly for me been one of the most powerful things in terms of my self-exploration, self-understanding.
I'm really looking forward to Howard's class starting hopefully in January.
Hopefully we'll have that.
I feel like I was very skeptical of it at first, just because I would take these tests and I kept getting different results, and it's like, how do I know this is even legit? Right?
Of course, how dare anyone tell me what I am?
Well, I mean, I'd taken other personality tests before,
I know,
right?
But that's a total 8 trait right there. That's a way to.
I don't know.
I'm not gonna let anyone tell me.
With all of them, even Myers-Briggs and all, I just got the feeling that they were so strongly dependent on my mood at the time
sure,
that,
psychology.
yeah.
Yep. Okay, well that's a good example. You got any other spiritual inbreakings, inbreaking of the spirit, God moments in life, other moments like that?
Oh gosh, I'm sure there are, but
what does prayer life look like for you?
It starts with like I said, my morning devotionals, and then throughout the day, when I try to pause when things are getting more and more turbulent. I don't know. It's like this constant tension, I guess, between being intentional about what I'm doing and praying continuously, however you want to define it, as Paul said, and balancing that with, I guess, being in the world as well, and deadlines and all of that. So,
yeah. How do you be in the monkey brain, right? Just the
right,
reacting to stimuli, getting the job done, putting the fire out, whatever, and also be mindful, be centered, be attuned.
Yep. Yeah, that's that's something I've been struggling with a lot recently, and
and I find there's so many. It's funny. I often say to people when I'm talking about or teaching about contemplative practices or meditations, these things, I always tell people it's funny because I think most people naturally think okay, when I sit down to meditate, when I sit down to do Lectio Divina, when I sit down to do centering prayer, any of these things, right? The daily examine, that is my time with God. But yes, sure, yes. But the true point and power of those practices is they do something to your, I don't know, outlook, perception, mind, so that in that struggle that you're naming, more often we pause.
Right.
Reflect,
I agree with that.
Attune,
Yep.
That's the true power to me of, if you want to say spiritual disciplines or prayer practices. It's that part of it,
Yep.
But I think a lot of people fail to ever really recognize or see that.
Yep. And that, I guess, inbreakings of God into my life. I mean, honestly, I hesitate to knowing our audience, but a lot of those have come under the influence of psychedelics. I mean, I have found those to be a very powerful spiritual tool as well for delving deep and, sort of the introspection and, yeah,
that's probably it's a difficult thing to explain to any folks that have maybe never gone down that route. So it's hard to put words around. But did you find the spirituality of that by accident, or did you go into that with that intent?
Initially by accident, and then later on purpose.
And so is there any particular experience or learning that you would name from that?
The general connectedness of everything, and I guess it's hard to explain the feeling of being at one with the universe and all of that. Experience is too deep for words. If they were that easy to come up with words for, I'm sure somebody would have come up with something better than me by now. But
yeah, probably have to go read Terrence McKenna or something.
Right.
So what strikes me when you say that though too is it's funny because that experience, that type of experience for you, and then also your science background and understanding sort of converge in that, right? Like in a way, this is totally Brett putting words into your experience, so don't allow me to do that if it's not correct. But like, when I hear you speak from a sort of science perspective, your understanding of the universe, it is the same language of interconnectedness, all being of the same or of one, that you also experienced in sort of these substances.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
Yes. And a lot of these substances are made by our bodies, right?
Right.
Like DMT is made endogenously.
Right.
And
right. That's interesting. So, and that's one angle we hadn't hit on is just, which I don't know if there's anything to say there, but just your, it's something that I am not a scientist, and I do not have the language for this just sort of layman stuff. But various times in my conversations with you and folks like Tracy and other people, other friends we have, there's been sort of, I don't know, a sense, I could be totally off, but a sense that science, at least our most sort of fringe, maybe a bad word for this, but fringe science is beginning to prove is probably not the right word either, but to talk about, explore things about the universe that the earliest religions that we have record of were saying about the universe.
Yeah.
Which to me is just, well, it's very exciting, but it's just mind-blowing that, like, you know, the Vedas, I mean, the earliest forms, you know, coming out of like the you know, India region, you know, Sanskrit, you know, the way they spoke about the universe, people used to just laugh at, and they'd be like, oh, that's Eastern religion mumbo jumbo, you know, whatever. And now, like, all of a sudden, from my layman's understanding of what science is exploring, they're sort of corroborating those ancient texts.
Yes. I mean, I think there's been a lot of hubris on the part of Western science over the past 200 or so years, and understandably so, because the progress they've made that's been made is pretty astounding, and you could see how somebody might get carried away with it. But
sort of has become a fundamentalist religion, really.
In some minds it has. I mean, that's not universal among scientists, but yeah, there's definitely that wing of scientists that think, you know, that matter is all there is, and but that's absolutely as much of a statement of faith as anything you'll find in the church. You know, that the science, as I use air quotes, does not support that. Right. That you know, protons and neutrons and electrons are all there are. You know, science is at most silent about a whole lot of things. Right? We can't see any parts of the universe that the light hasn't had time to reach us, right? So science will forever be silent about anything beyond that.
Which in some ways should be like the starting point perspective
for
science. Like, there's a whole lot we don't even try to touch because we already recognize we can't know.
Right.
but that humility is no longer there in much of science.
I think it's getting better. I mean, I think it was a lot worse, you know, 100 or 150 years ago. Like, if you there are quotes from leading scientists at the end of the 1900s who thought that humanity had discovered everything. And you could see why, because, you know, you had Newton's laws of motion. They did an excellent job of describing how the planets work and eclipses, and they had just recently got Maxwell's equations that describe how light and electricity and magnetism work. And there were just these couple of oddities that people couldn't explain. And, well, what do you know, when you peeled those layers back, there were whole new branches of physics that people... I mean, Einstein came out with relativity and then quantum mechanics, which for those non-scientists among us... those are the two sort of main pillars that our scientific understanding rests on, or at least that in physics. And we know that one or both of those must be wrong, because we know that those two theories don't play well together. They're incompatible. So that's but it works because one you only use for very large scales, and the other you only use for very small scales. And there are very few instances in the real universe where you need something that can describe both.
But even that, you would think that, I mean, like there's such a discrepancy there. There's such a that's so odd what you just described.
Yeah.
So you would think the science world would just be filled with much more of a humble approach.
You would think.
You know?
And
whereas much of what I see or experience and talk to, I mean, the other day in an interview for this show, someone was describing how like it sort of was a requirement, a pressure to be an atheist in their science community, and I think that's pretty well experienced almost across the board for most scientists.
I personally haven't experienced that, but then again, I'm kind of like socially obtuse when it comes to those kinds of signals. So maybe people tried to pressure me into that, and I just didn't pick up on what they were putting down.
That's right.
That's completely possible.
Your Enneagram 8-ness just allows you to charge right through all of it.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
They don't call you guys 8 holes for nothing. I'm kidding. Okay, that's interesting. Well, I don't know.
But I guess the thing scientists are people too, and they have their own egos, and they get protective about their ideas, and nobody likes to admit they're wrong. And
well, of course, and then there's natural things like academia, the way it functions.
Yeah,
right. You dedicate your whole entire life to studying this one thing. You're becoming an expert in this one little corner of a science, and then of course you're going to resist it with all your might if something comes out that like undoes everything that you have given your life to, which is really a bad system. I get it, but that's not a great system.
Yeah, there are many flaws with institutional science as it's practiced today. Sorry, it's a big question, but anything else you would want to offer from your perspective of like God and science? Man, that's such an open-ended question.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate it.
You don't have to answer that.
I think it's interesting that so many of our scientific discoveries have brought us back to what theologians have been saying all along.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at.
Yeah, like 150 years ago, the scientific consensus was that the universe is static. Stars are where they are, and it was in the 1920s, about 100 years ago, that we discovered that the universe was expanding, and then not long after that we discovered the cosmic microwave background, the first light emitted from the Big Bang. So I think it was Lemaitre, was actually a Jesuit priest who he didn't coin the term Big Bang. It's funny, Big Bang was coined by one of the detractors, but he developed the theory. I think it's funny. It's as if the scientists had laboriously climbed the summit of this mountain to discover the origins of the universe or where it all came from, and they find the theologians already camped out there on the summit, but the theologians don't know how they got there. And it's
I quoted you the other day saying that.
Okay.
on this show.
Okay. Yeah, I said that in Sunday
I like
school
that.
once. So
I like that. It does seem though that like you mentioned the Big Bang, like that sort of feels rightly so as like the ultimate decision point of like where people come down on. So some you take that event
mhm.
and then people either say that had to come from something,
Right.
therefore there is a creator, or that came from nothing and that means there is no creator.
Right. I mean, I've talked to plenty of atheist scientists about these things, and not just atheist scientists, but plenty of atheists, period. And I don't know, whenever we have discussions, I try to dig deeper into their belief system and ask, there are two questions that they never give a good, or can never give a good answer to. And one is, why is there something instead of nothing? Mm-hmm. And the other is on morality, right? Yes, you could maybe explain how a moral code would come about through social evolution. Cultures that have beneficial moral codes prosper, while those that that rob and kill each other don't. But that still doesn't explain why any person should feel obligated to obey such a code once they've said that that's the case. If you're going to say that that's where our morality comes from, then don't come to me telling me that I did something immoral, or I guess I believe that slavery is wrong, was just as wrong 200 years ago as it is today, right? Mm-hmm. Just the fact that it was more socially accepted back then doesn't make it any more moral. Perhaps we cut figures back then some slack, whenever the controversies about our slave-owning founders of our country come up. I'm willing to cut them slack, just understanding that they're men of their times, mm-hmm. but that still doesn't mean that slavery was okay back then just because it was socially accepted.
Yeah, but so just to play devil's advocate, wouldn't the fact that it was socially accepted point to there not being sort of an innate morality in something, that it was an evolutionary sort of thing that developed? Like that the general public sort of accepted it?
I don't see how. I mean, I guess you could make that. That leads you down the path of saying that it was moral back then but immoral today.
Well, or just that the morality is there. It's a perception. It's an understanding that changes over time. Versus it's like already there, woven, subjective, and is there throughout time.
I guess we get to the Christian concept of love, right? And yeah, there are many ways of showing love. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking out loud, but yeah, and so I mean, this is probably something else we don't have time to go down, but I don't know if you would. So so math too, science. Like, do you view that as a separate category in terms of like the conversation that we're having about, or is it the same thing?
Well, we watched that video for theology.
The system is like in place in the universe, and therefore.
Right. It's incredible that our universe seems to obey math, mm-hmm. right? That, there's, we watched that video in Theology on Tap, and I thought it made a good point that math is infinite. There are infinite numbers of digits of pi, and we can keep calculating them out. But, it's not something that we invent. We can't make them whatever we want, or else, our circles don't come out round the way they're supposed to. I do believe that math is like the language in which God has written our universe. I think science supports that. Now, that's sort of a value or a subjective based judgment, I admit. I mean, another scientist could come along and say it doesn't look that way to them, but yeah, to me it does.
I just think that so much of that, so much of even just this discussion does speak to, I don't know, it's just so fascinating to me, right? Like, so you named several times as one of the places of your experiencing God, if you will, a higher power, is through your learning, through intellectual, pursuits,
Yes.
And so it's just so fascinating to me how you can have these camps. I mean, really, it's the same conversation as the Big Bang question. You have these camps, people who are on intellectual pursuits, and they either have all that intellectual pursuit instilling in them or leading them to the conclusion that there is no higher power, or they have all those intellectual pursuits as instilling in them or leading them to the conclusion that there is. It's just such an interesting thing to me.
I mean, one of my favorite scientists, I'll say my favorite scientist is Richard Feynman, who was an atheist, but I watch late at night just his old lectures. And I mean, his book, he talks about why he became an atheist, and it wasn't because of anything science showed him. I mean, he grew up in a Jewish family, and he became an atheist when one of the rabbis told him that all of the stories in the Talmud were just stories to teach people. That it was that none of it actually happened. And
boy, that seems like a pretty mild thing to destroy your entire concept of a higher power, though.
There are
pretty mild.
If you listen to him talk, though, it's like he has a deeper understanding of God that's, outside of this sort of Western Judeo system. Because he'll talk about how nature is what it is, regardless of what you or I think about it.
Right.
You run the experiment, and nature tells you what it is.
See, that's so odd to me that someone that brilliant then also doesn't see that he's talking, that's semantics.
Yeah.
He got trapped in a thing of going like, oh, God is only contained in this Judeo-Christian organized religious form.
Yeah.
Right? And he can't extrapolate that out to say, oh, this thing I'm talking about in science, nature, the universe is God.
Yeah. I mean, this was also, he worked on the Manhattan Project, right? So this was like 30s, 40s. I think he died in the 80s. So this was pre-internet, I guess a lot less cross-pollination of ideas, but yeah, it is surprising that he would throw the baby out with the bathwater like that. But I guess he just got so interested in science, so many interesting things over here. Why fool with these folks who aren't even sure if they believe the things that they say they believe? But.
I want to be sensitive of your time. So, what these are all? I could talk about all these things all the time.
Yes.
So,
same here.
Anything else that just in the context of this show that you, Andy, want to name as, either a part of your life that has been a powerful experience of spirituality, or. Yeah, I guess I'm failing at my job as a host here. I ask everyone as a last question, what is the most powerful or intense or significant spiritual experience you've ever had, if you haven't already named it? Sort of, to me, sounded like it was that baptism moment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you named something else.
Yeah, that would be it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to, maybe not necessarily the most intense, but if I had to pick one as like a turning point in my spiritual growth, the time and the place in my life, along with everything else. Yeah, I'd go with that.
Okay. It's a beautiful image to pick, certainly,
Yeah, and not just the baptism part, but all that comes along with new fatherhood and, the, I guess the feelings of peace and, so many nights, trying to get an infant to go to sleep, and so many times the only way to do it was stop thinking about time and how long is it going to take, but to just focus on the infant, and to focus on the baby. And I don't know, there's that was very formative as well, I guess, in building, I guess, the patience and the mindset to allow yourself to slow down and focus on and be more present, I guess.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and it makes sense too. I mean, I know a lot of traditions don't necessarily require, like we do, to have baptism as a part of a congregational service, right? But there's that image again that's come through in your story of the importance of that body and those relationships. And so, that moment of her baptism being in a congregation with a community who's also taking promises on her behalf. And so that's a beautiful.
Although,
sure.
I don't know, we did it at the church up in Kingsport, and by the time that happened, I knew a few people then that still went there, so I don't know.
Communion of saints.
Yeah, there you go. In the broader context, beyond just the people in that building.
Yeah.
But,
well, cool.
They were fine folks too. That's not a slight to them at all. But
well, good, man. Anything else you want to name at all before we?
Nothing's jumping out at me.
All right, cool. Well, I appreciate you walking with me through this, and and we could go a lot longer on some of those topics, and maybe we will sometime.
Yep, I'm sure we will in Theology on Tap. But if you ever want to have me back on to flesh these out, I've been sort of speaking off the cuff.
Sure.
But I'm sure I could come back with a more well thought out thing if you ever want me me back. But.
Yeah, I'd love that. Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. We'll catch up with you soon.
Yep.
Thanks, brother.